It is well known that fairies have an aversion to iron. Why? Why? Fairies have no aversion to the blood of humans that contains iron. In fact, many of them quite like this stuff. The answer lies in a seemingly trivial incident in history that I will recount to you now. Wise, clever, wealthy King Solomon spoke all the languages of beasts and men. He was a very busy man. The world was dazzling then and full of wonders. There was a war in heaven, and many giants still walked the earth. King Solomon was tasked with building the first temple in Jerusalem, but the heavenly host forbade the use of iron to hew the stone, since the sound of clanging tools sounds much like the arts of warfare. Nevertheless, the stones must fit together perfectly so that not even a feather could fit through. At best, Solomon knew that the stones could be hewn because they must be hewn. However, he had no idea how it might be done. He questioned his 700 wives and his 300 concubines. He questioned his council of wise men and circumspectly asked other kings what could be done to accomplish the task. Hiram of Tyre had sent the stones to Jerusalem, and many were the warnings of what awful things would happen if the clanging of metal was heard in the vicinity of the first temple, but there were no ideas about how to hew the stone. It was such a very basic thing. Some say the suggestion came from the Queen of Sheba, and some say it came from King Hiram of Tyre, who was himself a rather accomplished magi. Asmodeus, the king of the demons, might know how the stone for the first temple might be hewn. He'd been on earth for a little while at that point. Solomon sent a trusted servant to Asmodeus's mountain cistern. That's a big thing full of water, cistern, with a magic chain, a plug of wax, and a skin of wine. Having arrived at the cistern, which was in Persia, what became Persia later, the servant drilled a hole in the cistern to let all of the water out. He then plugged up the hole with wax and filled the cistern with wine. It might have taken a few trips. Eventually, Asmodeus drank all the wine and fell drunkenly asleep, at which point the servant chained him up and bore him back to Jerusalem. When in the presence of Solomon, Asmodeus changed his form to that of the wise king, at first ironically, but then sincerely. The two tested each other's wits for days. At length, Solomon discovered that a tiny worm called the shamir could be used to break the stones somehow, but it was owned by the prince of the sea, who entrusted the secret only to the moorhen, who used the tiny worm to split stones on the highest mountains. Asmodeus laughed to think of mighty Solomon thwarted by this tiny, tiny bird. Solomon found a moorhen's nest with young in it, with tiny little peeping featherless birds, covered it with a sheet of rock crystal, and watched the nest. The little bird came back, saw the nest, flew away, and came back with a tiny object in its beak that it used to break the rock crystal. Solomon carefully took this from the bird and stored it in a wisp of wool inside a leaden box. This was the shamir obtained that cut the stones for the first temple. When it was done, Solomon was so exhausted that he asked Asmodeus, who impersonated him quite well, to sit on his throne for a year and a day. Thus the demon king did, and no mortal was the wiser, but the shamir disappeared when Asmodeus was gone. And I know you're wondering, what does this have to do with fairies? Well, fairies, some of them, are angels that fell down because they saw that there was a very wise king that they thought was Solomon, but was actually Asmodeus, doing very subtle things to get them to descend and not be able to come back up again. So they weren't really bad, they were just misled. They were cast out of heaven in the war, and they bounced. They didn't sink down to hell, and they became fairies. And they can tolerate the sound of clanging metal now, but they still bear an aversion to iron after what happened, I think mostly out of embarrassment.